Hey everyone, it's Blake with ChessPathways.com, and in this video we're going to be talking about how to calculate in critical positions. This is something I've been asked about a lot by a lot of our Chess Pathways members, so I wanted to give you all a framework for how to think about these critical positions, as well as give some examples from some of my recent games. So here is one of my games from the World Open 2019 against Kalada Onabogan, who's rated about 2300. I'm showing some of the first few moves here just for some context. We get an advanced Caro-Kann, he plays the short variation, and then he goes for this pawn sacrifice here, so I'm up a pawn, but he's hoping to get some possible compensation from it because my king is still quite a ways away from getting castled. I develop and defend that pawn, he goes ahead and pins that knight, I finally get castled, he exchanges on c6, and plays rook c1. So this is the first position of this game that I felt was a critical position. So let's pause for a bit and talk about what I mean when I say critical position. In a sense, it's almost kind of subjective in a way what a critical position is, because what might be a critical position to some players might have no secrets for a stronger player. They might know instantly what to do in that kind of position. Just for example, let's go back to the opening here. After knight f3, e6, bishop e2, c5, castle, knight c6, c4. I didn't really consider this a critical position, even though there's a lot of possibilities here, a lot of pawn tension in the center. I didn't think it was that hard to find the answer here, that I have to take on c4, and after white doesn't throw in this move where he takes on c5 and he takes back on c4, I had to do a little thinking, but it wasn't too hard to figure out that I think I just have to accept this pawn sacrifice and kind of go from there. Jumping back ahead to this position though, what made it a critical position to me was that I had lots of moves I was considering playing here, and just from some of the initial lines I was calculating, it looked like the evaluation of the position could change drastically based on which one I chose. In other words, when the second best move is much worse than the best move, the position's critical. It becomes very important for you to find the best move. Another good indicator that a position is critical is when it's very tactical, in a kind of complex way. We see we have this pin here to the knight. White has two attackers on this d4 pawn. They could possibly deflect my queen away by taking the knight at some point, depending on what happens with this bishop. There's some x-rays here where the bishop's under attack. The bishop's actually currently hanging, and the c-pawn is currently under attack too. So there's a lot going on in this position. I'm currently up a pawn, and if I can find a way to consolidate that, or even if white can win the pawn back but has to make a concession to do so, that could be very good for me. But the move I choose in this position is going to be very important. This isn't just like an opening, kind of which rook do I put on this file decision where it's probably, pretty close between the two options. It's very important to calculate deeply here and find the best move. Some of this comes with experience. Sometimes you can't definitively say if a position's critical or not, and it's kind of a good skill to have to categorize positions in your mind as critical or not, because you want to invest the majority of your time into critical positions. You get limited time on your clock, and you want to spend most of it in critical positions. But for me, this position was critical, so let's go through the process that I teach my students here of how to handle this position. Some people are taught to think like a tree, so to speak, in these critical positions. This is a concept that was popularized by Grandmaster Kotov in his book, Think Like a Grandmaster, written about 50 years ago now. Hard to believe it's been that long. But basically the concept was, you consider all your possible moves, your candidate moves, so to speak. From all of those moves, you consider all your opponent's possible moves that are reasonable. To all of those responses, you consider all of your possible moves again, and you go further and further down this tree in all the possible variations, pruning out moves that you've determined are definitely bad, until you arrive at the line that represents best play. Now, theoretically, yes, this is kind of what's going on. You're considering your candidate moves, you're evaluating your opponent's responses, but doing it so formulaically isn't necessarily practical in a real-life game situation. So I'm going to show you in this video how I go about making a decision in these critical positions, and how you can as well. So step one in a critical position is to come up with a high-level, general assessment of the position. You're not calculating anything yet, you're just coming up with an assessment of how you think you're doing in this position. Now, this is not a step you want to spend a lot of time on, and as you start calculating, your assessment may change, but it's just good to have a baseline for how you think about this position. This is helpful because if you think you have a position where you have a big advantage and you start calculating lines that look drawish, you're probably not going to be happy about those lines. You're going to look for something better because they don't match your assessment of the position. On the other hand, if you think your opponent has a slight advantage and you start calculating a line and you find a line that looks drawish for you, you're probably happy with that. You're still going to look for something better, but your initial assessment is always going to shape how you see the lines you're calculating. So step one, don't spend a lot of time on it, but come up with a general assessment here. In this position, my assessment was I was pretty happy with my position. I thought I had a good chance to get an advantage. I'm currently up a pawn, and I know I'm facing some tactics here. White has the option to possibly win their pawn back at some point, but I thought I still had a decent chance to find a good line here, make white make a concession somehow to get the pawn back, and I thought I had a good chance here to stand better. So once you have some general assessment of your position in mind, and again, never spend more than like 30 seconds to a minute on that step, because it's going to be molded by your calculation. It's subject to change. But once you have your initial assessment in mind, now we're on to step 2, and that's to come up with a list of candidate moves for yourself in the critical position. So I would highly encourage you to do that right now. I'll remove that arrow for you. Go ahead and pause the video and think about which moves you would consider playing here as black. Alright, hopefully you're back with me and you have a list of possible moves to play here for black. So our bishop's under attack, right? So that already severely limits our number of candidate moves we have available. For example, we know we don't even have to consider moves like a6 because they make no sense. They just hang a bishop and achieve absolutely nothing. So there's really only a few moves here that make any sense at all. And by the way, that's another kind of criteria I think about for whether a position's critical or not. If you have 15 different choices in a position that look reasonable, it's probably not a critical position. That probably means you're in some slow phase of the game, you're kind of maneuvering your pieces, and it's not so critical to find the absolute best move in this position. When there's only 3 or 4 moves that make any sense at all, and it's likely that one of them is a lot better than the others, that's how you know it's a critical position. So okay, candidate moves. Our bishop's under attack, there's only one safe space it can go, so certainly bishop b6 is a candidate move. What about ways to defend our bishop? Queen d5 was one of my candidate moves here, queen to d5. Queen b6 was another candidate move, just defending that bishop and also helping to defend the d-pawn and eyeing the b2 pawn that's undefended. Because it's a tactical position, you always want to be thinking checks, captures, and threats, right? Those are the kind of the 3 categories that get drummed into every beginner's mind when it comes to tactics. Always consider the checks, captures, and threats. So far we have queen d5 as a candidate move, queen b6 as a candidate move, and bishop b6 as a candidate move. And I would also throw in f6 was a move I considered, just because it creates a threat, it breaks this pin to our knight, and it's a move that's worthy to consider. So okay, now we have our list of candidate moves. We have 4 of them, and I think besides those 4, there's not really any move that makes any sense here. Everything else just seems to hang a bishop. So okay, now we start calculating. And I would recommend starting with what you consider to be the most ambitious of the candidate moves. So I started here with f6, and I dismissed this move pretty quickly. You can pause your video if you want and think about why. Okay, if you're back with me. So remember, when you're considering moves, you always want to consider your opponent's checks, captures, and threats too. So I started by the most obvious reply, what if they just take this pawn? And I really couldn't find a good answer. Now we have 2 pieces under attack, so we probably have to recapture that pawn. I didn't see anything else here that looks reasonable. And if we recapture the pawn, then it looks like, again, I looked in this position for checks, captures, and threats. Bishop h6 was the obvious move. The bishop's under attack, so they have to move it. And after bishop h6, then we just have the rook's under attack here, the bishop's under attack, and I really couldn't find a very good answer to anything in this position. Maybe we can consider queen b6 sacrificing an exchange, but okay, this looks kind of dubious. I decided to stop looking at f6 because this just looks very dangerous. We're probably losing material. And notice that I didn't have to consider every possible option of this tree. That would get exhausting. You would spend, over half an hour on most critical positions if you had to do that. After f6, sure, white has the option to just exchange off. They take our bishop, we take their bishop. I think they even win a pawn there too, possibly, so that might be another refutation. But with all these possible lines I was looking at, it just looked clear to me that this did not fit my initial assessment of the position. I thought white was getting an advantage in a lot of these lines. Again, I can come back to f6 if I look at the other candidate moves and I go, oh no, I'm in trouble there too. I'm in trouble everywhere. I have to look for where I'm in the least trouble. Then yeah, I would come back to f6, because now my initial assessment changes. But for now, I decided to dismiss f6. That's how you start eliminating some of these options and narrowing it down. Okay, the next most ambitious move I thought was queen b6. That was another candidate move. So I'll let you go ahead and pause if you want to and try to start assessing queen b6. Okay, so at first glance, I liked queen b6. It defends the d-pawn and adds pressure to the undefended b2 pawn. So my first candidate move for white that I thought looked reasonable, again, when looking at their checks, captures, and threats, is I thought after queen b6, one of white's likely options was going to be to exchange on e7, force this bishop to come back to e7, and then take on c6, because now that bishop would be out of the way and that pawn would be loose. White has 2 attackers on it. but then I thought I could take on b2. And I spent some time trying to assess that position, and I thought it looked kind of pleasant for me. I have the 2 strong bishops against the 2 knights. I win that b2 pawn, and it looked good. So try to go through that in your head. Try to really force yourself to calculate here. Don't just see it on the board. But if you want me to show it on the board, here we go. So again, after queen b6, I thought this was a likely outcome for white. To exchange off, take on c6, I get to take on b2, and I assessed that as better for me. Now, can we stop there and just play queen b6? No. Remember, really force yourself in response to all the moves you're considering playing. Consider all your opponent's checks, captures, and threats. So what I saw when I looked for other possible moves white could play is that after queen b6, it looked like queen c4 was going to be a big problem, because now there's 2 attackers on my bishop, and it's kind of trapped. It has nowhere to really go, and the more I looked at this, the more I was unhappy here. So queen b6, and white doesn't have to take on e7. Queen c4 was the move I was concerned about, threatening this bishop, and this looks to be trouble for me. If I play bishop b4, I think there's just a3, and I don't really have an option here to save the bishop. Bishop a5 runs into either b4 trapping the bishop, or now the knight is hanging, and black's in trouble. So really, after queen b6, I thought that I just simply didn't have a response to queen c4. I thought this was just almost winning for white. So again, I don't have to keep looking there through white's other possibilities. I think I've refuted my own move, queen b6. Again, I can come back to it if it turns out every variation leads to trouble for me. Every candidate move leads to trouble, then again, I have to pick the lesser of the evils, of course. But for now, it's time to dismiss queen b6. Queen c4 simply looks too strong. Coming back to our critical position here, so now we're only down to really 2 options left. Queen d5 defending the bishop, and simply retreating to b6. So okay, queen d5 was the next move I looked at. Go ahead and pause your video if you want to try to assess this line. Remember to look for your opponent's checks, captures, and threats. Okay, so once again, if I played queen d5, white would have the option to take on e7. I would have to take with the bishop, and then white would win a pawn back. They could take this c6 pawn. So I saw that possibility, but I thought that wasn't really a huge deal. It's kind of a concession for white to have to give up the bishop for the knight. I would have the 2 strong bishops in that position. I would still have my strong pass d pawn. So I thought, okay, that looks pretty reasonable. I'm not really afraid of bishop takes e7. I assessed that as just kind of slightly better for black, and I decided to keep looking for other forcing moves from white. Remember, once you calculate one possible option they have and you think it's good for you, you can't stop. You have to keep looking for all their other checks, captures, and threats. So it turns out, after queen d5, I saw that they had this threat to play b4. And I knew to look for this because I knew that this knight was kind of dependent on this bishop, so I should always look for moves that harass that bishop. And this very forcing move looks to have no good answer from black. There's nothing I can do here to not lose material. The bishop certainly can't take that pawn, can't come to d6, and if I come to b6, then simply the knight is hanging. So I didn't give up just yet. I always tried to look for in-between moves that I can possibly make in these kind of positions. So I was looking at, let's just go back so we can practice our visualization. I was looking at playing queen d5, and if they played b4, is there any way I could make f6 work? Trying to counterattack that bishop, so if they take my bishop, I can take theirs. But that's pretty easy to refute. I just saw after queen d5, b4, f6, they can take with the rook instead of with the pawn, and they're attacking my queen with tempo, and I don't have time to take their bishop, and I'm simply down a piece. Just to show it on the board, again, queen d5, b4, if I try the in-between move f6, now not pawn takes c5, but rook takes c5, and I don't have time to take their bishop. So I think that just about refutes queen d5. Queen d5, b4 is just winning for white. So now I started to get nervous. Remember, my initial assessment was that I was doing pretty good here, but now 3 of my 4 possible options I've assessed as essentially winning for white. So I was like, wow, that only leaves bishop b6. If this turns out to be winning for white too, my assessment seems to be completely wrong. Maybe white's doing really well here, and I have to really, dig down and try to find the lesser of the 4 evils. So okay, go ahead and pause your video if you'd like to assess bishop b6. Okay, hopefully you're back with me. So what bothered me about bishop b6 is that white doesn't have to give up the bishop for the knight and kind of give up this pin to take the c6 pawn. I was worried that after bishop b6, white could take on c6 right away. Now, I very quickly dismissed queen takes c6, because that doesn't really make use of the pin. I can take with the knight, and if you take my queen, I take back. Just to show it, I can show it. I win a queen, you win a queen, I win a piece. That was easy to dismiss. So after bishop b6, I thought rook takes c6 was definitely the scariest move, because this rook could come to d6 on the next turn, and try to cut off my queen from this pawn and win that pawn too. And white could end up winning both of these pawns if I'm not careful. That was my concern. But I started looking deeper, and I saw that I had some answers here. So after bishop b6, rook takes c6, I saw that f6 would be a candidate move in that position. I'm not sure if it works or not. At first I thought it worked good, because it cuts off this pin, and now I could take this knight possibly. I was looking at lines like f6 takes, and now I can take here. I thought that was promising. But I looked for candidate moves from white. Again, you never want to assume, and I saw that they could meet f6 with rook d6. So I thought, okay, it's not just that simple. But again, I'm not trying to go super deep into any of these lines. I'm trying to come up with kind of a general assessment here first. So after rook takes c6, I saw f6 was one possibility, but I would also have the candidate move to just play queen d7 and pin this rook to the queen. And I thought if I did that, they would pretty much have to take on e7. And I saw some of these lines where they were possibly winning a second pawn, but the more I looked into them, the more they looked kind of promising for me. For example, if I pin that rook to the queen, and white really wants to win that second pawn, something like this. I didn't look too deeply, but I saw that I had a couple very promising options here. I thought bishop e4 was very promising, attacking that bishop, getting on this long diagonal, and threatening to swing my queen out next turn to either g5 or h4. Also, the immediate queen h4 looked very promising, pinning this knight to the queen. And if the knight moves, then f2 is hanging. So these lines started to look very promising to me. Let's just go back to the initial position here, this critical position, and see if you can visualize all this from here. So again, we're looking at bishop b6, with, by the way, the huge threat to play c5 next turn and solidify everything. Then we're just kind of up a pawn for good, a strong, protected passed pawn. So white's got to do something there. They can either take on e7, but that doesn't look too scary. We're definitely not worse there, for sure. They can take on c6, but then maybe f6 is a possibility, like I was saying. Maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't work out. But we could also simply move the queen, pin the rook, and then I saw this whole line where they can take, and if they really want to win this pawn, that would now be undefended. We have some very promising options there, either bishop e4 or swinging out to the king side. So notice that I didn't calculate everything out, but by this point, I'm almost completely confident that bishop b6 is the best move out of my 4 candidate moves. The other 3 seem to lead to very bad positions. This one, I haven't calculated everything out, but I've calculated enough to know that it's the best possible move. So in a practical game, you just play the move and you go from there. So I played bishop b6. So it's not always that simple. Sometimes you do have to go back and forth between some of these options like I mentioned, kind of evaluating them against each other. But here I turned what looked to be a very complex position, and I broke it down until the decision was pretty simple. One move was just clearly better than the rest after analyzing them all, and I picked it. Okay, in the game, white played rook takes c6. So here we have another critical position. Go ahead and think about this one if you want to. Pause your video. Okay, so general assessment, I think it's pretty much the same as the last position. I think black has reasons to try to be looking for an advantage here, if the moves justify that. And as for candidate moves, I'm curious to see what you came up with. I think pitting the rook is definitely a good candidate move, either queen d7 or queen e8. f6, of course, is a very forcing candidate move. I mean, if you play f6, they have 2 pieces under attack. The bishop's under attack, and the knight's attacking the rook. So that's probably going to be our most ambitious candidate move. And also just kind of advancing our passed pawn and defending it, putting it on the defended d3 square. That also looks like a possible candidate move. Maybe there's other options here too, like maybe bishop c7 can even be considered. Just making sure the rook can't come to d6 and eyeing this the e5 pawn so that if the knight takes on d4, we can maybe take on e5. But I think looking at these more forcing, more ambitious options first, at least, is probably the right way to go. Okay, so let's start by trying to calculate f6. Definitely a very ambitious move. White would have the bishop under attack, and the rook would now be under attack because the pin's broken. So try to calculate out f6. I'll remove that arrow for you. Okay, so we can really filter out white's options here after f6. Any retreat of the bishop probably doesn't make sense. We just simply win the exchange, and I thought I was pretty happy there. So after f6, white's two only options are to take on f6, or to play this rook d6 move that I saw earlier, kind of getting a tempo on the queen. So after f6, e takes f6 was one of the first moves I looked at, and now I wondered if this worked. Can I take on c6? I saw f7 was a potential threat here. Winning the queen, right? And it's not time to give up on that line yet, I don't think. We could potentially get enough compensation for a queen, but I don't know. I wasn't too thrilled about a position like this. We have a rook and a minor piece for the queen, but I mean, this pawn's probably about to fall. I didn't think this was great for us. I thought white might actually have a pretty sizable advantage here. So I kind of dismissed this line. Going back here after rook takes c6, f6 though. Remember, after they take, we don't have to take this rook and risk losing our queen here to this move f7. We can take back, and they still have 2 pieces under attack. And here their obvious move is bishop h6, kind of counterattacking our rook here. And I was having some trouble assessing this. It turns out this is very good for black, but I was not able to really accurately assess this in the game. I was looking at, okay, if I save my rook, they just save their rook, and now my king's really open and weak. If I take their rook, they take my rook, and then, I don't know, if I take their bishop, they take my knight. That's all equal material exchanges. If I save my knight, they save their bishop. And I'm not really sure what I accomplished, and my king looks pretty weak, and I wasn't sure I really liked this so much. It turns out, though, I missed a really key detail in this line. I didn't look deep enough, and that's the danger here. You start seeing some position like this in your head, and you just say, oh, it's just all equal exchanges, right? You know, I take the bishop, they take the knight, or I save the knight, they save the bishop. My king's open. But if I would have looked just a little bit deeper, if I take that bishop, they actually cannot take the knight. I have rook c8, back rank mate, and white is in big trouble. So if I would have looked just a little bit deeper, I could have seen that e takes f6 just isn't a possibility here, because recapturing is so strong. The rest of this line is pretty much forced. White's going to lose material no matter what. After they take on f6 and I take back, and after bishop h6, I take the rook, they have to take here if they want to maintain material, and then I take, you take on c6 and rook c8 with the back rank problem. But I just didn't look deep enough, and that's a common problem in critical positions, knowing how far to keep going. We've talked about how you can't go forever, right? You can't calculate every line and every subline to its absolute conclusion. It's just way too much. Having that skill of knowing when to filter moves out and when to stop is critical, but as long as there's still threats in the position, you should probably keep going and evaluate them, and I just missed that the queen couldn't take on c6. Easy to miss, but I would have liked to have found it. Unfortunately, in the game I didn't find it. I thought after f6 that taking might be good for white in that line. I thought even rook d6 might be good for white, and I decided to stop looking at that line. I thought I saw too many things there that looked pleasant for white, because I was really excited about this queen d7 possibility, just pinning the rook to the queen, and I thought I saw some really good things here after queen d7. Like I said, I calculated this out instead, and saw that they really have to take my knight here, otherwise I'm gonna, win this pinned rook. I did see they could play rook c4, but I didn't think this was so great for them. I just exchange queens or something and have a good passed pawn. So I was really looking at this line where they can take here and win their pawn back, and then queen h4, and I thought this was just so promising for me, with all these threats to the knight and to f2. So I decided to not waste too much more time here and made the kind of pragmatic decision, or you could call it the lazy decision, because I had just spent a lot of time on the previous move. I didn't want to lose too much clock time, so I simply played queen d7 here. And that's what I mean when I say you can't always go through the whole tree process every single time. I didn't spend any time really trying to figure out bishop c7 or try to figure out what happens on d3 and they can play rook d6. I just simply was happy with queen d7. I tried to calculate the most ambitious line and wasn't happy with it, so I played queen d7. Now in the game, white did indeed have to exchange here, and now they evaluated it was not worth winning this free pawn here on d4 because of how strong some of these options were, bishop e4 and queen h4. So instead, they just tried to finish their development, and black has a decent-sized advantage here. The two bishops are much stronger than the knights, and I can quickly put a rook on the d-file, but it's not the winning position I might have gotten if I would have invested the time to really figure out f6 a little deeper. So hopefully this is making sense about how kind of the theoretical process goes when you have a critical position, but also how sometimes you have to be pragmatic, filter some stuff down. Always try to look at the most ambitious tries for both sides, but in the end, you gotta pick a move that you're happy with in a reasonable amount of time. And by the way, I should mention, after knight bd2, I did not consider this a critical position any longer. There's no longer nearly the amount of tactics there were a couple moves ago. The position's kind of settled down, and you don't want to spend too much time in these non-critical positions. So I just very quickly played rook f to d8. It seemed very natural to me to just add more defense to this pawn that was hanging, get this rook into the game. It didn't take me very long to make that decision. In the end, my opponent defended well, and the game was a draw. So thank you very much for watching. I might go ahead and make more videos on this topic if this turns out to be a popular subject matter. And if you haven't already, make sure you go right now to chesspathways.com. It's completely free to join. I'm giving away a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. We have a lot of exclusive content and contests, and it only takes about 5 seconds. So go there right now, chesspathways.com, and make sure you get signed up. Thank you all for watching, and I will talk to you again shortly.